Hi, I'm Dustin Abbott, and I'm here today to bring you another episode on the sensor performance from the 5D Mark IV. And so in a previous episode, we have talked about the dynamic range and demonstrated how that there has been a significant gain made in that area with the 5D Mark IV. In our second episode, we examined the high ISO performance, and we found that while the gain is a little less noticeable in some ways, that it is equally significant that Canon has managed to add a huge number of new pixels to the equation, while also managing to keep the noise levels down at acceptable levels. And so overall, it's actually according to those that rate these sensors, outside of the Canon 1DX Mark II, it is the best sensor that Canon has when it comes to that kind of performance. And so today we're going to look at the resolution from the 5D Mark IV. In the midst of all of the hype that has come as a part of the launch of the 5D Mark IV, there have been a lot of accusations of people saying that the camera is soft and the images aren't as sharp as what they should be. And of course, people, even before the camera ever was in anyone's hands, there was a lot of hoopla over how that there was an AA filter and that anti-aliasing filter was going to result in the camera just not being sharp. And so a lot of that drama out there. In today's episode, we're going to cut to the chase and discover whether or not that brand new 30.6 megapixel sensor that Canon has placed in the 5D Mark IV, whether it's really delivering a visible benefit when it comes to added resolution. Now, before we jump into some actual illustrations, let me just give you this little bit of information to consider. When I was reviewing the Canon 5D Mark IV with an even huger 50+ megapixel sensor, when I first took the very first images and I loaded them on the computer and I zoomed into a pixel level, I expected them to just jump off the screen with additional sharpness and resolution, and they didn't. And I was initially disappointed and thought, what's all the hype about? But one thing you have to realize is that when you view high resolution, high megapixel camera images at a pixel level, they don't necessarily look sharper at a pixel level than cameras with fewer pixels. Because at a pixel level, you're still looking at the basic pixels, but what you don't realize is how many more of those pixels there are. And so if you back away a little bit, or if you reduce the image size, the image resolution, down to the equivalent size of that lower resolution model, you'll find that there is, in fact, way more resolution that's there. It's just you can't necessarily see it in the same way at a pixel level. And so in this little study that we're going to do, we're going to both look at the native size of images and compare them to the 6D, and so we'll compare it with those. But then also we'll look at the reduced or downsampled images and how that they compare to look at the real world resolution gains. And I think you'll find that interesting. At the same time, we're also going to look at the additional benefits that come from being able to significantly crop into an image and still have a lot of resolution that's there. And we'll talk about the benefits of that. So let's jump in and let's take a look together. I wanted to illustrate the point regarding the overall resolution. This is actually an image I took with the 5DSR, or rather it was an image taken of me and my son with the 5DSR. And so if you zoom into a pixel level, of course the image looks very crisp and sharp, but at the same time it doesn't look exceptionally so. And when I first look at images like this, it's like, well, that doesn't really look a whole lot sharper than the 6D. And at a pixel level, it may not be. The difference is, of course, is that I could crop that in to this point here and still have as many pixels in the frame as what you can with the 6D. And of course, if you were to downsample to the 6D's resolution level, you would have far more pixels and thus far more detail crammed into that shot, and thus a whole lot more resolution. So the same is true when we compare images from the 5D Mark IV and the 6D. On a pixel level, while there is more resolution that is apparent there on the 5D Mark IV, it's not really incredibly different. Now we'll find that as the sensor resolves some of the distant details, that you're able to make out more detail in the 5D Mark IV image as compared to the 6D. Note in this tree here, there's more detail and more contrast there. And by the way, this is shot with basically the pinnacle of lenses on a tripod, with a live view, 10 times magnification focus, and a shutter release used, and so that there's no vibration. This is the Zeiss Mill was 135 millimeter f2 shot at f5.6. So optically, it doesn't get any sharper or better than this. But as you can see, there's obviously more contrast and more resolution than the 6D image on the right. But you could look at that and say, well, that's not significantly different. What's the big deal? But in this case, what I've done is I have downsampled the 5D Mark IV to the pixel density of the 6D image. And so let's take a look now at the kind of difference that we see. So obviously now when we compare at a similar pixel density, we see that there is far more detail in the 5D Mark IV, thus far more resolution. Look at areas like this, along here in this tree, much more detail is showing up there. And as we move along here, look at this compared to that. Also the superior dynamic range of the 5D Mark IV makes an impact here as well. Look at this here, very clearly more definition that's shown there. And if we look here on the more, the closer shore here, obviously a lot more detail showing up there. And that's true all across the frame. And so here you see that there is much more resolution that comes because of that higher pixel density. And we're going to examine that a little bit further in some more comparisons here. Okay, in this comparison we have got on the left, we've got the 5D Mark IV. Both of these were shooting the same lens. In this case it's the Tamron 24 to 70 millimeter f2.8. And so we've set them up to where we have similar values here, although the exposure is a little bit different. But first we're going to look at the native pixel level. And so as a result, of course, things will look bigger on the 5D Mark IV simply because there is greater pixel density there. And so as we look, comparing the amount of detail here, you can see a little bit of an advantage for the 5D Mark IV, particularly when you look at something like this, although it's not highly noticeable. If we look at the side of the bridge and the texture here, you can definitely see more detail on the 5D Mark IV image. Similarly down here, if we look at these stones or that wall in the distance, there's just a little bit more resolution all around. Looking here, you can see a difference. If we move out towards the edge of the frame, obviously it's, we're dealing with the depth of field at f2.8, but looking here you can definitely see a difference in the texture. Now the downside to having more pixels is that it will make things like a chromatic aberration, which we see some green fringing here, also along this pole. It's more obvious in the 5D Mark IV image than what it is in the 6D because of that greater pixel density. Similarly here, we're going to look now at a more optimal resolution, f5.6. And so as I look at the side of this, it looks initially like there is more sharpness and contrast with the 6D image. And, at this point, things look more stable. However, if we look at the resolution along the bridge, there's still a pretty noticeable advantage for the 5D Mark IV image. In the details beyond, we see a difference there. And as we look towards the edge here, things look, I would say, roughly similar. But of course, this is at the native pixel level. So now to give us an apples to apples comparison, I have taken the 5D Mark IV images and I've downsampled it to the pixel dimensions of the 6D. And so now let's see what's the actual resolution comparison. Now as we look there, we can see that there certainly is an advantage for the amount of detail that's being rendered by the 5D Mark IV. And it's quite noticeable if you look at the texture here, for example, a lot more texture information that's there. And here, as we look along this part of the frame, and then as we look at the textures close to the edge, we can see certainly a notable advantage for that. Now these are raw images without sharpness added to them. Now, while at first I was unhappy with the JPEGs that I was getting out of the 5D Mark IV, it was really because I hadn't yet fully tweaked the settings to what I wanted. And now, after spending some time with the camera, becoming familiar with it, I'm actually quite happy with the JPEGs that I'm getting out of the 5D Mark IV. Now here, as we compare at a native dimension, 5D4 on the left and 6D on the right, we can definitely see more detail in the 5D Mark IV image. And as we look towards the sign, you can make things out more clearly there. And as we look towards the side of the bridge here, you can see a huge difference in the amount of texture information. And this is even at the native resolution, which is significantly larger on the 5D Mark IV. But what happens if we compare them at similar resolution? So now if we compare the downsampled image from the 5D Mark IV, where it's at the similar pixel level, we see a tremendous advantage for the 5D Mark IV when it comes to its rendering of textures, which look much crisper and more precise here. And you look at this area up here, it looks quite soft by comparison on the 6D, and the 5D Mark IV is looking much, much better when it comes to that. Off towards the edges of the frame, we see a similar advantage here, where the textures have become kind of mushy here. They're nicely defined on the 5D Mark IV image by comparison. And then similarly along here in this area, while we have a little bit different lighting at the moment, you can see that there definitely is a big difference in the amount of pixel density and resolution there. So the practical value of something like this is that you can take an image like this. I shot this with the 100 to 400 millimeter f4.5 to 5.6 LIS Mark II. And so here we have the native pixel level of the 5D Mark IV. And so we can see looking in that we have a nice, nice sharp, detailed. This is a pretty challenging situation, shot at ISO 2500, and a little fellow like this with very dark fur, you have to really get a lot of exposure to get the detail. But the 5D Mark IV has done the trick. We've got great detail in the fur. And so the advantage here, of course, when it comes to this type thing, is that on the right, I've got an image that I've cropped to the pixel level of the 6D. And so now I have that much crop already built into the frame. And let's take a look at this now full size. And so here, this is a crop down to the 60 pixel level, and so it's given me that much more reach, but with the same pixel density and detail and information on this little fellow. And so it just shows the potential of having that extra resolution and those extra pixels to work with. Then similarly, if you're shooting portraits, I've got a couple more illustrations here. This portrait shot with the Tamron 85mm f1.8 VC lens. And so we see here at full resolution that, there's great detail. You've got the detail around her lips and so, awesome amount of detail. But having those extra pixels has the advantage of that I can crop to a more pleasing, and in this case, I even rotated the photo to get a little bit more of a better upright framing of the face. And at the same time, even though I've cropped significantly, there's still a massive amount of detail there where you can see, pores very easily. So it gives you an advantage of shooting portraits that you can frame a little bit more loosely and then have more to play with in crop or in post when cropping, and still have tons of resolution if you want to make a print. And obviously I could crop even like this and still have at a 1:1 level have plenty of resolution. And that has a practical value too if you're shooting with a wider lens. In this case, I shot with the Canon 35mm f2.IS lens, and so it was actually set up on a tripod, and I was remotely shooting for this because in these groups of series of pictures, I was actually a part of some of them. And so I wanted to leave a wider scene so we could include some of the environment. And these are my daughter and some of my nieces here. And so, but at the same time, obviously, at a pixel level, there's lots of detail there. And so what that means is that I could go to a much tighter and more pleasing crop for this particular picture and still have tons of resolution here and be very able, if I wanted to do a print from that. And so it just enables you to maybe avoid on some of the edges. Let's go back for a moment. It's not so much a problem with the 35IS, but if you're shooting a group, for example, and towards the edge there might be a little bit of distortion, you could frame a little bit wider and be able to crop off the edges where people might get distorted, keep people more to where distortion is not affecting them, and be able to crop in and still have plenty of resolution for that. So as you can see in real-world use, not only are the images nice and sharp that are coming out of the 5D Mark IV, but that added amount of resolution does make a significant difference when it comes to your ability to crop either portraits or wildlife type shots and get closer to the action, so to speak, while still having enough pixels to have nice big prints from the result of it. That is a significant gain, and it's a very real value that comes out of that. When the actual megapixel rating of the 5D Mark IV was announced, I personally was really excited because when I was doing my review of the 5DSR, I found that for myself, this may not be true for you or for other photographers out there, but for me, the 50 plus megapixels was overkill. I just didn't need that much resolution for my average shooting. But I found myself often shooting at the medium raw setting on the 5DSR, and that came out at about 28 megapixels. And I found that to be kind of a sweet spot in that it showed a significant gain of resolution over what I was accustomed to shooting, either the 20 megapixels of the 6D or the 22 megapixels of the 5D Mark III. And at the same time, the file sizes weren't so huge and the load on my computer not so great that it made life less difficult than with the full resolution images from the 5DSR. And so I was excited by that resolution setting. And now that I've been shooting with the 5D Mark IV, I continue to be very happy with the choice of resolution value that Canon has gone with. It is large enough, in fact, it's probably larger than what I actually need, but I do enjoy having that extra amount of resolution when it comes to being able to crop or to give me more flexibility in how that I approach processing with the actual camera's images. And at the same time, it's been able to realize these other gains that we've seen in dynamic range and high ISO performance. And so to me, I think that Canon has found a nice sweet spot, and I've been very impressed with the performance from this sensor. And now that I've been able to tweak the JPEG engine to my own liking, I'm very pleased with the JPEGs that are coming out of the camera. I'm happy with the raw images and their ability, their latitude for processing and sharpening. Overall, as a stills camera, I am very happy with the 5D Mark IV. I'll be bringing you my final conclusions, and also I'll give you another episode where I examine the video performance from the camera, which has been somewhat controversial. And if you haven't seen it already, I do have some 4K footage that I have uploaded. You can take a look at that. And another thing I'll be looking at is the actual autofocus performance and whether or not there are any real gains to be had there. So I hope you've enjoyed this journey with me so far. Keep watching and following along. You can see my image gallery down below, as well as a linkage to follow me on social media. Keep watching for great content, and if you haven't already, please subscribe. Thanks for watching. Have a great day.